23 March 2022. We're working our way through Martin Luther King Jr.'s famous letter from Birmingham jail. Today is the second of three lectures on that letter. We're making, I think, good progress. We're reading it and discussing it paragraph by paragraph. You can follow along not only with the original version of King's letter, but with my illustrated guide that's been posted on Canvas. So you may want to pause the video and get those items out so you can follow along. I think I'll be happy today if I can get through paragraph 23. That takes us about 2/3 of the way through, and I think we'll then be in a position to finish things up on Monday next week. Remember, your second exam is on Thursday, 31 March, which is 8 days from today. Okay, let's get back to it. We've finished paragraph 9. I'm going to now read paragraph 10 of King's letter, and then I'll go back and forth from reading King's letter to my commentary on it. And I hope that in the process, you see some things that you may not have seen when you read the letter on your own. In other words, I'll try to put some of the things King says in historical context. If he makes some point about the law, I'll pause to explain it, and so on. So my goal again is to help you understand his letter, and my exam questions will be drawn either from his letter directly or from my illustrated guide or from something else I may have said on this video that comes from neither of those sources. Okay, here's paragraph 10 of King's letter. One of the basic points in your statement, now remember he's talking to the 8 clergymen, at least that's his immediate audience, but I think that when King wrote this letter, he had a much larger audience in mind, an audience not only of all Americans, but perhaps all people around the world. He's appealing to the consciences of his audience, wherever they may be. He's trying to show that the treatment of blacks in cities like Birmingham is unjust, and he's trying to justify his, what he calls direct action, which is his program of nonviolent civil disobedience. Okay, back to paragraph 10. One of the basic points in your statement is that our acts are untimely. Some have asked, why didn't you give the new administration time to act? The only answer that I can give to this inquiry is that the new administration must be prodded about as much as the outgoing one before it acts. We will be sadly mistaken if we feel that the election of Mr. Boutwell will bring the millennium to Birmingham. While Mr. Boutwell is much more articulate and gentle than Mr. Connor, remember Connor's nickname was Bull Connor, and I think that suggests a little bit about his demeanor and his actions and his character. While Mr. Boutwell is much more articulate and gentle than Mr. Connor, they are both segregationists, dedicated to the task of maintaining the status quo. Now, you know what segregation means. It means dividing up a group of people spatially, maybe in other ways as well, but at least spatially. So there are parts of town that are reserved for black people and parts of town where blacks are excluded. That's called segregation. The opposite of segregation is integration, where the peoples are mixed together spatially or in other ways. Now here's King continuing. The hope I see in Mr. Boutwell is that he will be reasonable enough to see the futility of massive resistance to desegregation. But he will not see this without pressure from the devotees of civil rights. My friends, I must say to you that we have not made a single gain in civil rights without determined legal and nonviolent pressure. History is the long and tragic story of the fact that privileged groups seldom give up their privileges voluntarily. Individuals may see the moral light and voluntarily give up their unjust posture. But as Reinhold Niebuhr has reminded us groups are more immoral than individuals. Okay, that's his paragraph 10. Now turn to my guide and let's put some context to it. I'm reading from page 7 of my guide. King replies to the objection that his actions are untimely, in the sense of coming at a bad time. Why not give the new mayor, Albert Boutwell, time to act? Perhaps things will be better than in the past. King says that, quote, the new administration must be prodded about as much as the outgoing one before it acts, unquote. In other words, the new administration is likely to be just as bad as the old one. Both Connor and Boutwell, King says, are, quote, dedicated to the task of maintaining the status quo. When King uses the term devotees of civil rights, he is referring not just to Negroes, remember that's his term, but to all those who participated in the civil rights movement. Many white people marched shoulder to shoulder with King, and some were arrested with him. Whites who worked with King were called traitors to their race and other derogatory names. Here is the march from Selma to Montgomery in March 1965. Note the police officers in the background. King, and when you look at that image, you can see that there are blacks and whites mixed. Are there any women? I see mostly men. Yes, I see at least one woman, what appears to be a woman in the background. So it's a mixed crowd, of racially speaking and in terms of sex. And the police officers in the left background are watching the march. King laments the fact that, quote, we have not made a single gain in civil rights without determined legal and nonviolent pressure. Nothing has come easy. Privileged groups, he says, seldom give up their privileges voluntarily. And they may not acknowledge that they are privileged. Notice, that's my addition. King didn't say that, but one reason people don't give up their privileges voluntarily is they may not even believe that they are privileged. King may be credited with inventing the concept of white privilege, though I haven't found a use of the term white privilege in his writings. So I'm not saying he coined the term, but he may be credited with the concept, the idea of what you've probably heard called white privilege. King ends the paragraph with an interesting observation, namely that, quote, groups are more immoral than individuals, unquote. The terms mob behavior and collective irrationality describe the phenomenon. One sociologist, and I remember this from my college years long ago, I couldn't find who said this. It was some famous social scientist. One sociologist has written that the intelligence of a mob is less than the sum of the intelligences of its members. Think about that. If you were somehow to add up the intelligences of each individual member of a group, according to this sociologist, it's greater than the intelligence of the mob. And the idea is that somehow when people come together and form a group or a mob, they aren't thinking as clearly or as rationally, and they end up doing and saying things that they wouldn't otherwise do. It's as though being part of a group emboldens them to do things that they would never think of doing on their own as individuals. And so King is pointing that out. He says groups are more immoral than individuals, perhaps because they're more irrational than individuals. Finally, note King's use of the phrase, my friends. This is another attempt to build rapport with the clergyman and anyone else who reads his letter. So he's using gentle, inviting language, like my friends. He's appealing to things they have in common. He's appealing to their sense of goodwill. He's appealing to their better nature. Remember Lincoln's famous phrase, the angels, the better angels of our nature. Okay, back to King, paragraph 11. King says, we know through painful experience that freedom is never voluntarily given by the oppressor. It must be demanded by the oppressed. Frankly, I have never yet engaged in a direct action movement that was, quote unquote, well-timed, according to the timetable of those who have not suffered unduly from the disease of segregation. For years now, I have heard the words, wait. It rings in the ear of every Negro with a piercing familiarity. This wait has almost always meant never. It has been a tranquilizing thalidomide, relieving the emotional stress for a moment, only to give birth to an ill-formed infant of frustration. We must come to see with the distinguished jurist of yesterday that justice too long delayed is justice denied. We have waited for more than 340 years for our constitutional and God-given rights. Now, I'm going to talk about all this in a moment, but let me finish reading it. The nations of Asia and Africa are moving with jet-like speed toward the goal of political independence. And we still creep at horse and buggy pace toward the gaining of a cup of coffee at a lunch counter. I guess it is easy for those who have never felt the stinging. Now, if you look at the last page of this letter, you'll see a bunch of corrections that were added, and I put them in the text. You can see the red written word there, darts. King himself apparently read the draft and said, no, that was a typo, or I want to change that word. So I'm going to read it with the change. I guess it is easy for those who have never felt the stinging darts of segregation to say, wait. But when you have seen vicious mobs lynch your mothers and fathers at will and drown your sisters and brothers at whim, when you have seen hate-filled policemen curse, kick, brutalize, and even kill your black brothers and sisters with impunity, when you see the vast majority of your 20 million Negro brothers smothering in an airtight cage of poverty in the midst of an affluent society, when you suddenly find your tongue twisted and your speech stammering as you seek to explain to your 6-year-old daughter why she can't go to the public amusement park that has just been advertised on television, and see tears welling up in her little eyes when she's told that Funtown is closed to colored children, and see the depressing clouds of inferiority begin to form in her little mental sky, and see her begin to distort her little personality by unconsciously developing a bitterness toward white people. When you have to concoct an answer for a 5-year-old son asking in agonizing pathos, Daddy, why do white people treat colored people so mean? When you take a cross-country drive and find it necessary to sleep night after night in the uncomfortable corners of your automobile because no motel will accept you. When you are humiliated day in and day out by nagging signs reading white and colored. When your first name becomes, and here I'm going to refrain from uttering the word, but you can see it there. King uttered it. I'm not uttering it. When your first name becomes, I'll call it N-word, and your middle name becomes Boy, however old you are, and your last name becomes John, and when your wife and mother are never given the respected title Mrs., when you are harried by day and haunted by night by the fact that you are a Negro, living constantly at tiptoe stance, never quite knowing what to expect next, and plagued with inner fears and outer resentments, when you are forever fighting a degenerating sense of nobodiness, Then you will understand why we find it difficult to wait. There comes a time when the cup of endurance runs over, and men are no longer willing to be plunged into an abyss of injustice where they experience the bleakness of corroding despair. I hope, sirs, you can understand our legitimate and unavoidable impatience. So that's his paragraph 11. It's probably the longest one we've read so far, and maybe the longest one in the whole letter. And naturally, I have a lot to say about it. So turn to my handout at the bottom of page 8, paragraph 11. Here are some of the things that I would like to point out to you. This long paragraph is filled with allusions, metaphors, and analogies. Here are the main points, and I have them bulleted. To the privileged and powerful, direct action movements are never well timed. When privileged people say wait, they almost always mean never. Without direct action, King says, nothing will change. Nothing. Things will remain as they have always been. Secondly, King mentions thalidomide. You probably have never heard of that. In fact, it's before my time as well. Thalidomide was a sleeping pill, a tranquilizer that ended up causing horrible birth defects. There's a Wikipedia entry on it if you want to learn more. King uses it as an analogy. The word wait, he says, has had the effect of tranquilizing or putting to sleep the oppressed, only to give birth to an ill-formed infant of frustration. Note that King used analogies that made sense to his readers. Thalidomide was on everyone's mind in 1963. So King is a good writer. He knows how to make use of figurative language, analogies, metaphors, and things like that. So he chose an analogy that he was sure his readers would understand. Again, because thalidomide was horrifying everybody at the time. Third bullet point, King says that, quote, justice too long delayed is justice denied, unquote. This phrase is thought to derive from British statesman William Gladstone, and I give you his birth and death dates. It is sometimes rendered as justice delayed is justice denied. That's the way I often hear it. But you can see it obviously came from what Gladstone said. King says that he and his people have waited for more than 340 years for their constitutional and God-given rights. Now, what does that mean? If you subtract 340 from 1963, when King's letter was written, you get 1623, which is close to the year 1619 in which the first African slaves were brought to North America. So I'm pretty sure that King is talking about the period of time between the first importation of slaves to North America and the present day. It's about 340 years. King, by the way, that a number of years have passed since King's letter was written. Recently, we passed the 400th anniversary of the first importation of slaves from Africa to North America. That was 2019, 3 years ago. King describes some of the humiliations that Negroes experience on a daily basis. He mentions a 6-year-old daughter. His daughter Yolanda was 7 at the time, so he probably was alluding to her, although not by name. Later, he mentions a 5-year-old son. His son, Martin Jr., was 5 at the time, so he's probably alluding to Martin. This shows that he's speaking from personal experience as well as careful observation. The point of this recitation of humiliations is to appeal to the consciences and sympathetic imaginations of his audience. Walk in our shoes for a while, he seems to be saying. How would you like it? He's saying to white people around the country, perhaps you don't know what it's like to live as a black person, especially in the South. Let me try to convey it to you. And in this long paragraph, he does. King mentions sleeping in one's automobile while taking a cross-country drive. Why does he mention that? Because many places of public accommodation, such as hotels, bars, restaurants, theaters, were closed to blacks. To help blacks find accommodations during their travels, a book was published. Here is its cover. Now, it comes out a small black and white cover in my notes, but if you look at it on canvas, I believe it will show up as green. It had a green cover. And I've depicted the cover of that book there. And guess what? In 2018, just 4 years ago, the Academy Award, what's called the Oscar, for Best Picture went to a movie called Green Book, which is about this book. Interesting. So if you want to learn a little bit of history, I'm sure you could watch that movie, and perhaps that will give you a feel for what life was like for black people at this time. I can also share a story with you. The first African American or black baseball player in Major League Baseball was Jackie Robinson. I believe he came to the majors in the 1940s. He played first for the Brooklyn Dodgers and later for the Los Angeles Dodgers when the team moved across country. And I've read some stories about Jackie Robinson and what it was like for him to play for the Dodgers. He was called vile names almost everywhere he went by fans in the stands. He couldn't, in some parts of the country, he couldn't even go into the restaurant to eat with his teammates after the game. And I read one account that's very sad, and that is that when his teammates went to a restaurant to eat, he was not allowed in because he's black. He was made to eat his meal in the back alley, outside the restaurant, outdoors, in the alley. They put up a table and a chair so that he could eat his meal. Can you imagine anything more humiliating and degrading than that? And here was one of the greatest baseball players of all time. He was the Rookie of the Year in his first year, and I believe he won at least one Most Valuable Player award. But socially speaking, he did not have the same status as his own teammates. Okay, paragraph 12. This one's shorter. This is King speaking. You express a great deal of anxiety over our willingness to break laws. This is certainly a legitimate concern. Since we so diligently urge people to obey the Supreme Court's decision of 1954 outlawing segregation in the public schools, it is rather strange and paradoxical to find us consciously breaking laws. One may well ask, how can you advocate breaking some laws and obeying others? The answer, King says, is found in the fact that there are two types of laws. There are just and there are unjust laws. I would agree with St. Augustine that, quote, an unjust law is no law at all. Notice that he underlined the words just and unjust. That's his way of emphasizing them. So, strictly speaking, you should read it like this. There are just and there are unjust laws. Notice I put an emphasis on those words. Okay, back to my notes. Paragraph 12. King and his followers had been criticized repeatedly for disobeying, i.e., breaking the law. So he replies to the criticism beginning with this paragraph. He actually spends a great deal of time replying to this objection. He begins by noting the irony of supporting certain laws, such as the Supreme Court's decision in Brown versus Board of Education, which outlawed racial segregation in public schools, while advocating the breaking of others, such as laws against trespass and parading without a permit. King says that he agrees with St. Augustine that an unjust law is no law at all. If this is so, then it is important to distinguish between laws that are just and laws that are unjust. And for your interest, I posted an image of St. Augustine, one of the great Christian theologians from the 4th and 5th centuries. So Augustine made an important distinction between those laws that comply with morality. He called them just laws, laws that are in accordance with justice, and laws that violate moral principles, those that are unjust. And according to Augustine, those laws that are unjust are not laws at all. They're not real laws. They have the form of a law. They look like a law. They may be on the law books, but they're not really laws. Morally speaking, they're not laws because, according to Augustine, in order for a law to be a valid law, it must comply with moral principles. It must be a moral law, a just law. Now, King is going to make use of this important distinction, and you could probably see where he's going with it. If King can show that a particular law is unjust, morally speaking, then by applying Augustine's distinction, by applying Augustine's dictum to it, he can conclude that it's not really a law. It looks like a law, it's on the books, but because it violates moral principles, it's not really a law. It fails the test of a law, which is to be in accordance with morality. You understand what I'm saying? So King is situating himself in what's called the natural law tradition, which goes back to at least through Augustine and perhaps even farther back into the ancient world of Aristotle. Okay, so that's an important point that you need to remember. King is situating himself consciously in the natural law tradition. And he accepts the dictum or saying that an unjust law is no law at all. Not really. It's not a real law. It's a fake law. It's a counterfeit. That's probably the best word. It's a counterfeit law. Imagine you've got a counterfeit coin. Imagine somebody had been making quarters and trying to make them indistinguishable from real quarters. Maybe only an expert would be able to notice the difference between the real quarter and the counterfeit quarter. So someone might say that only the quarters that are minted by the United States government are real, right? The other quarters they may look like real quarters, and people may be fooled into trying to use them as real quarters, but they're not real quarters. They're counterfeits. Okay, so that's the distinction that King is drawing upon. All right, let's read King's paragraph 13. He says, now he's going to start drilling down on this distinction. Now, what is the difference between the two? How does one determine when a law is just or unjust? And here's his first stab at it. A just law is a man-made code that squares with the moral law or the law of God. In other words, it's in accordance with moral principles. It's in accordance with justice. An unjust law is a code that is out of harmony with the moral law. It doesn't accord with the moral law. It's in discord. Right? It conflicts with the moral law or the law of God. To put it in the terms of St. Thomas Aquinas, an unjust law is a human law that is not rooted in eternal and natural law. Now, Thomas Aquinas, was a 13th century Christian theologian and philosopher, and he endorsed Augustine's view that an unjust law is no law at all. King says, any law that uplifts human personality is just. Any law that degrades human personality is unjust. Now that's his second stab This is his second attempt to explain the difference between a just law and an unjust law. Notice, uplift means raise the status of. Degrade means lower the status, take someone down a notch or a grade. Degrade, uplift. Now that's figurative language, and it's not King's final attempt to mark this distinction, but he's working his way toward the final version. All segregation statutes, by the way, there's a typo that nobody caught. It says statues, like a statue of Abraham Lincoln. Obviously, he means statutes with a T in it. That means an enacted law. So I'm going to read it with the corrected version. All segregation statutes or laws are unjust because segregation distorts the soul and damages the personality. When you separate people by race in schools and in neighborhoods, you are damaging either those who are kept out of the other place or perhaps all of the people. Maybe even whites are damaged by segregation. This was an argument that was made in that famous case, Brown versus Board of Education. The argument, which cited social research, tried to show that even white students suffered because of the segregated educational facilities, the segregated classrooms. And the argument was that all students are better off in an integrated classroom setting. They can learn from the experiences of people who aren't like them, for example. Okay, so King is saying that segregation degrades people and is therefore unjust. It distorts the soul. It damages the personality. Now here's King talking again. It gives the segregator a false sense of superiority and the segregated a false sense of inferiority. They're not really superior to or inferior to one another, but because they're segregated, they get the idea that they are inferior and superior. And it's a false idea, a false sense of superiority. The white kids falsely believe that they're better than or superior to the black kids. The black kids feel falsely or believe falsely that they're inferior to the white kids. To use the words of Martin Buber, the great Jewish philosopher, segregation substitutes an I-it relationship for the I-thou relationship and ends up relegating persons to the status of things. Notice, I, thou. Thou means you, I and you. That implies that we are on a par with one another. We are equals. We're on the same level. But I, it, that's a hierarchy. I am up here. Mere things like this paper are down here. Okay, I am the master of this paper. It's a mere thing to me. Right? It's a mere object. And I treat it accordingly. I can dispose of it or burn it. I can tear it up. I can shred it, whatever I want to do. But you don't treat people that way. The proper relationship between people, between persons, is one of equality and equal respect. So notice King is drawing upon the work of a great theologian, a Jewish theologian, it so happens, and he's talking about horizontal relationships, I, thou, and vertical, which is I, it. And the problem with segregation is that it treats people as though they were mere things rather than persons. So King concludes, segregation is not only politically, economically, and sociologically unsound, but it is morally wrong and sinful because it treats people as though they were things. Paul Tillich, who's a Protestant theologian, Paul Tillich has said that sin is separation. Isn't segregation an existential expression of man's tragic separation, an expression of his awful estrangement, his terrible sinfulness? Now, there should be a question mark instead of a period because that's a question. So I can urge men, now there's another change King inserted. So I can urge men to disobey segregation ordinances because they're morally wrong. So notice, before I get to my comments, and maybe I'll repeat myself, but let me say this. King is saying that injustice has to do with how you treat people, treating them as less than persons. And segregation does that. Segregation is therefore sinful, immoral, wrong, unjust. And because there are laws on the books that enforce segregation in schools, public conveyances, residential areas, and so on, those laws conflict with morality. And those laws, therefore, are unjust. And now I'll go back and apply Augustine's dictum. An unjust law is no law at all. King is saying that these apparent laws are not really laws because they fail the moral test of a law. And that leads King, as you will see, to the claim that you may disobey these so-called laws. Even if they were legitimate laws, even if they were valid laws and duly enacted by the legislature, you may disobey them because they're not really laws. They're not in accordance with morality. Remember, an unjust law is no law at all, no matter how valid it may be in accordance with how it was brought about. Okay, so that was King's paragraph 13. Here are my comments on it, and they're a little bit long. King's first attempt to distinguish between just and unjust laws is as follows. A just law is a man-made code that squares with the moral law or the law of God. An unjust law is a code that is out of harmony with the moral law. He quotes St. Thomas Aquinas, a prominent natural law theorist, who held that human, or what's called positive law, it's called positive law not so much because it has positive value, but because it's posited. It's related to the word deposit. When you deposit something, you lay it down or put it down. So if I posit something to you, I'm laying it down that. I'm asserting that that is the case. So positive law is law that is laid down or enacted by human beings, not by God or angels or any other beings, but by human beings. That's called positive law. Natural law is the law of God. It's the law that transcends human positive law. And according to natural law thinkers like Augustine and Aquinas, human law, in order to be just, must conform to natural law, the law of God, or the law of morality. It has to conform to moral law. Okay? So King quotes Thomas Aquinas, who's a prominent natural law theorist, who held that human or positive law must conform to divine or natural law in order to be valid, in order to be a valid law. Now, I put in parentheses, Aquinas agreed with Augustine that an unjust law is no law at all. It's actually a little more complicated than that, but I don't want to confuse you. I'm going to assume, for the sake of going forward, that Aquinas just agreed with Augustine's dictum. But some scholars think that Augustine had a much more sophisticated view than Augustine's. Again, I'm going to bracket that debate. I need to keep things on track, and I don't want to confuse you. King states the difference in another way. Quote, any law that uplifts human personality is just, Any law that degrades or lowers human personality is unjust. This distinction may be easier to apply in practice, though one still has to know or be able to determine what uplifts and what degrades human personality. Here's an image of St. Thomas Aquinas, in case you're interested. Now, applying the standard, King writes the following: all segregation statutes are unjust because segregation distorts the soul and damages the personality. He quotes the Jewish philosopher and theologian Martin Buber, who, like Immanuel Kant, Kant, earlier than Buber, condemned treating persons like things. The implication is that discrimination or segregation on the basis of race treats black people like things, or at least as less than the persons they are. Finally, King mentions Paul Tillich, the Protestant theologian whose work was the subject of King's doctoral dissertation, and that was at Boston University in 1955. In fact, here's the title of King's doctoral dissertation. I tracked it down. The title is A Comparison of the Conceptions of God in the Thinking of Paul Tillich and Henry Nelson Wieman. Okay, it was accepted in 1955 at the Boston University Graduate School. According to King, I can urge men to disobey segregation ordinances because they're morally wrong. Now, I debated whether to put the next paragraph in. It's a little complicated. I think I'm just going to I'm going to refrain from reading it right now. You can read it if you want. I'm going to just give you the gist of what I'm saying in simpler terms. King is saying that it's permissible to disobey these segregation statutes that segregate blacks and whites. In other words, King is saying that certain laws may be disobeyed. What's the basis for that claim? Well, it could go either way. King could say that they're not laws at all. Because these laws violate moral principles, because they're unjust, one may disobey them. They're not really laws. And if they're not really laws, then strictly speaking, you're not disobeying the law. Right? Here's the reasoning. A law to be valid must comport with morality or justice. These segregation laws do not comport with or conform to moral principles or justice. Therefore, these segregation statutes are not valid laws. Therefore, I'm not disobeying them when I march without a permit or trespass on someone's property, because they're not valid laws at all. The other way King could go with it is to admit that they're valid laws. He could say, yes, these laws were duly enacted by the legislature or the city council, but these laws, while legally valid, are morally wrong. They're unjust. And whenever there's a clash between the law and morality, you are permitted to go with morality. Again, you reach the conclusion that it's morally permissible to break even valid laws, laws that are validly enacted in accordance with the procedures that are laid down in the positive law. So King can reach the same conclusion that it's right to disobey these laws in either of two ways. He could try to show that they're not really laws at all, or he could admit that they're laws, but insist that they're unjust laws and may therefore be disobeyed. That's what I was trying to convey in that paragraph that's on pages 11 and 12. Again, you can read it over. It's a little complicated, but I just gave you the gist of it in different words. Okay, moving along. This is paragraph 14. from King, and this one's quite short. Let us turn to a more concrete example of just and unjust laws. An unjust law is a code that a majority inflicts on a minority, and that is not binding on itself. This is difference made legal. On the other hand, a just law is a code that a majority compels a minority to follow, that it is willing to follow itself. This is sameness made legal. All right, that's paragraph 14. Here's what I have to say about that. King gives, quote, a more concrete example of just and unjust laws. He says that an unjust law is a code that a majority inflicts on a minority that is not binding on itself, whereas a just law is a code that a majority compels a minority to follow, that it is willing to follow itself. Do you see the difference? King appears to be saying that justice requires a single standard for all, not a double standard, one for oneself and one for others. Now, let me stop right there. Have you ever heard the term a double standard? Probably you have. Often the term is applied to expectations of men and women. A woman who has multiple sexual partners is often disparaged, called names, and you can imagine what she might be called. A man who has the same number of sexual partners may not be disparaged. In fact, he may be lauded. It may be assumed that a man who has multiple sexual partners is simply experienced. But a woman who has the same number, she is this, that, or the other thing, and you can fill in the terms. Now that's a double standard, arguably. Unless you can point to a relevant difference between men and women, you should apply the same standard to both of them, not separate standards, one for men, one for women. So that's called the double standard. And supposedly it's a bad thing. I think King is saying the same thing here about two types of laws. An unjust law imposes a double standard. Right? That's one way to think of the problem with an unjust law, is that it imposes a double standard. One standard for this group, a different standard, maybe a harsher standard for this other group. And what King is saying is that justice requires the imposition of one standard, a single standard for all. Again, unless you can point to a relevant difference. Now, there may be a relevant difference. Let me give a silly example. Suppose you're a parent. You have two children. Let's make them identical twins, just to hold as much as we can constant. Must the parent always treat those identical twins the same? I think any parent would say, no, of course not. What if one of the twins broke the household rules today and the other one didn't? The parent may punish the one who broke the rules, but not punish the one who didn't break the rules. So there's a case where differential treatment is justifiable because there's a relevant difference between the children. The relevant difference is one broke the rules and the other one didn't. But let's change the situation. What if the identical twins acted in relevantly similar ways? Neither one broke rules that the other one refrained from breaking. You would have to say that the parents should now treat those identical twins the same. Treat them the same. In fact, someone might argue that people should be treated the same unless and until you can point to a morally relevant difference between them. One of them broke the law or committed a crime, and another one didn't. Maybe one of them worked harder than the other one. They both worked, but one of them worked twice as hard for some common good. Arguably, therefore, the one who worked twice as hard deserves more in the way of reward. It's not that the one who didn't work hard deserves to be punished. but the one who worked harder may deserve to be rewarded for it. So King, I think, is getting at this notion of a double standard. And it goes back to the ancient world, back to Aristotle. Right? It's a view of what justice is. Treating people justly means treating them the same unless and until you can point to a morally relevant difference between them. Okay, where were we? I was reading my comments on paragraph 14. So here's where I'm going to pick it up. This is in keeping with Aristotle's famous saying that justice consists in treating likes alike and unlikes differently in proportion to their differences. Let me interject something here. Do you remember our discussion of Bonnie Steinbach's essay, Drunk Driving? Remember my reconstruction of her argument? One of the premises of her argument was likes must be or should be treated alike. She's claiming that all instances of second-degree murder should be treated alike. They should be punished alike. And when she looks out into the world, she says, here are second-degree murderers, those drunk drivers who kill, who are not being punished equally with other second-degree murderers. And that violates her sense of justice, right? Likes, she says, should be treated alike, not differently. Okay, so I've connected two of the readings for the course. Steinbach's essay, now we can see, connects up in this way with King's letter. If there are no morally relevant differences between whites and blacks, then justice requires that whites and blacks be treated alike rather than differently. King, of course, thinks that there are no morally relevant differences between whites and blacks. Why should it matter as far as being served at a restaurant? Why should it matter what color your skin is? Why should it matter what your ethnic background is, or skin color, or race, or whatever you want to call it? If you're hungry and you have money to pay for the meal, you should be allowed into the restaurant, right? It's morally irrelevant what your race is or skin color. So King, of course, believes that for most, if not all situations, race is morally irrelevant. And therefore, segregating people by race is almost always, if not always, wrong, unjust. And laws that enforce segregation are therefore unjust. And if you share Augustine's view, because they're unjust, they are not really laws. And if you break them, you're not really breaking the law at all, except in some nominal or formal sense. Okay, paragraph 15 of King. Let me give another explanation. An unjust law is a code inflicted upon a minority which that minority had no part in enacting or creating because they did not have the unhampered right to vote. Who can say that the legislature of Alabama, which set up the segregation laws, was democratically elected? Throughout the state of Alabama, all types of conniving methods are used to prevent Negroes from becoming registered voters. And there are some counties without a single Negro registered to vote, despite the fact that the Negro constitutes a majority of the population. Can any law set up in such a state be considered democratically structured? That's a new difference between just and unjust laws. Here are my comments on that. Paragraph 15. King gives another explanation of the difference between a just law and an unjust law. He says that, quote, an unjust law is a code inflicted upon a minority which that minority had no part in enacting or creating because they did not have the unhampered right to vote, unquote. We might think of this as procedural as opposed to substantive, justice. At the time King wrote this letter, there were various impediments to black voting. And here are just some examples. Poll taxes. In some parts of the South, in order to vote, you had to pay a tax. There was a tax on voting. Now, it may have been a very small amount of money that you had to pay in order to vote. But if you're very poor and you face a choice between paying the tax in order to vote and buying some food, you may decide, and it would be reasonable to decide, to buy the food. So the purpose of that poll tax undoubtedly was to discourage voting by certain groups of people, the poorest of the poor. And that may have been disproportionately black people. Okay, so on its face, it doesn't say anything about race. Right? If you read it on its face, you could say, well, all it does is require that anyone, white or black, who wants to vote has to pay a tax. Yes, but how does that requirement operate in the real world? And that it may have a disproportionate effect on people by race. It may have a worse effect on blacks than on whites, just because blacks, the higher percentage of blacks are poor than are whites. And another thing, I haven't said anything about the motive. Could it be, do you have to be a cynic to think that the purpose of that law imposing a poll tax might have been to suppress the black vote? Right? King seems to be suggesting that. He used the word conniving. Remember that? Conniving means having an ulterior motive. Other methods to keep blacks from voting were literacy tests. Again, if you start off with the fact that literacy is disproportionate, whites on average are more literate than blacks because they've been given a chance for an education or a better education. Any kind of literacy test that must be passed in order to vote will have a disparate impact on black people. And again, that may have been the purpose of the literacy test. And there are also grandfather clauses. Grandfather clauses allow people to vote if you can show that your grandfather was able to vote. The implication is if you cannot show that your grandfather was able to vote, then you, unfortunately, can't vote either. Again, any white person's grandfather would have been able to vote, but not all black people's grandfathers were able to vote. So again, that was a conniving law, arguably, designed to keep the blacks from voting. King refers to these as conniving methods to prevent Negroes from becoming registered voters. Now, if blacks are kept from voting, then in all likelihood, the people who are elected will not be black. They'll be either disproportionately white or overwhelmingly white. And those white people, once elected, will probably vote their racial or class interests, and legislation will be enacted that has a disparate impact on whites and blacks. And that's what King keeps talking about. The system is rigged. The white power structure has found ways to keep itself in power and to disempower or disenfranchise those who have no power. It's a rigged system. And in King's view, nothing will ever change about that system until direct action is taken. Right? Something is going to have to create some tension. There's going to have to be some conflict. White people are going to have to be threatened or coerced into coming to the negotiation table, the bargaining table. And that's the whole point of King's method of nonviolent civil disobedience, is to create that tension. How can a law be legitimate when it came about in such an unjust way? True democracy, the word democracy means rule by the people, all the people. True democracy requires full participation, or at least the opportunity for full participation by the citizenry. Okay? I don't think King is suggesting mandatory voting. King would be happy if everyone had the opportunity to vote. And that was not the case in many parts of the South, such as Birmingham. Okay, I put in a note for historical context. Black men in this country secured the right to vote in 1870 with the 15th Amendment to the United States Constitution. That's one of the three post-war amendments. After the Civil War ended, there were three amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th. The 15th secured the vote for blacks, but keep in mind that meant black men. No women, even white women, had the right to vote until 1920, when a new amendment, the 19th Amendment, was ratified and became part of the Constitution. So there was a 50-year period from 1870 to 1920, 50 years, in which black men, but not black women, at least nominally had the right to vote. That means they, at least on paper, they had the right to vote. But in practice, as I've been suggesting, there were all kinds of impediments thrown up to discourage voting or intimidate people and keep them from voting. Thus, by 1963, black men had had a constitutional right to vote for 93 years, and black women for 43 years. King's point is that having a right to do X and exercising one's right to do X are not the same. Compare de jure and de facto suffrage. De jure means in accordance with law. De facto means in practice. Okay? The law may say black people have the right to vote, but in practice, they don't have a right because of all these impediments, I'll call them. Okay, let's go another, I'll probably take an hour and 20 minutes because we've got a lot of ground to cover, so we have about 18 more minutes. This is paragraph 16. Again, it's fairly short. King says, these are just a few examples of unjust and just laws. There are some instances when a law is just on its face and unjust in its application. For instance, I was arrested Friday on a charge of parading without a permit. Now, there's nothing wrong with an ordinance or law which requires a permit for a parade. But when the ordinance is used to preserve segregation and to deny citizens the First Amendment privilege of peaceful assembly and peaceful protest, then it becomes unjust. And if it's unjust, according to King, it's no law at all. Here is what I say about this paragraph, page 13. King distinguishes here between a law being unjust on its face, i.e., as it is written, and a law being just on its face, but unjust in its application. He says that he was arrested for, quote, parading without a permit, unquote. There's nothing unjust about such laws. He admits that. But if they're enforced against disfavored individuals or groups, and not against favored individuals or groups, then the enforcement itself is unjust. King believes that the parade permit ordinance was used by authorities, quote, to preserve segregation and to deny citizens the First Amendment privilege of peaceful assembly and peaceful protest. This, he says, is unjust as well as unconstitutional. You see the point? King is suggesting that his permit, his application to march in a parade, to protest, was denied, whereas another group, relevantly similar to his, but made up of white citizens, would have been allowed to march. Their permit would have been granted. So King is saying the law as written is fine. Right? Cities need to be able to control the flow of traffic. So having a system of parade permits is, on its face, acceptable. but it all depends on how it's implemented or administered or applied. And King thinks that this particular parade permit statute was unjustly, discriminatorily applied to him and his followers. In fact, I can tell you that when King had one of his assistants go to the local office and apply for the parade permit, and Bull Connor said to this woman, he said, and I'm paraphrasing, he said, "You will not get a parade," what did he say? "You will not get a permit to parade in my town. I will parade you over to the local jail." Something flippant like that in his denial. Okay, paragraph 17, go back to King. He says, "I hope you can see the distinction I'm trying to point out. In no sense do I advocate evading or defying the law as the rabid segregationist would do. This would lead to anarchy. One who breaks an unjust law must do it openly, lovingly, not hatefully, as the white mothers did in New Orleans when they were seen on television screaming," and now he utters that word 3 times, the N-word, "and with a willingness to accept the penalty. I submit that an individual who breaks a law that conscience tells him is unjust and willingly accepts the penalty by staying in jail to arouse the conscience of the community over its injustice is in reality expressing the very highest respect for law." Now, this is a powerful paragraph. King is addressing the objection or criticism made by others that he and his followers are disrespecting the law. They're not showing proper respect for law and order. They're not showing respect for the rule of law. They're taking the law into their own hands. That's the objection. Here's what King says about that. King sets out conditions for breaking the law. The lawbreaker must not evade or defy the law. This, King says, would lead to anarchy. You don't break the law and run, try to get away. That would be evasion. The lawbreaker must break the unjust law openly, lovingly, and with a willingness to accept the penalty. King says that lawbreaking under these conditions expresses the very highest respect for law. The aim is, quote, "to arouse the conscience of the community over its injustice." Okay, here's the second paragraph. Breaking the law openly means not trying to hide, evade capture, obscure one's identity by wearing a mask or hood, or resist arrest. Breaking the law lovingly means, at a minimum, not doing so hatefully, which means full of hate. King gives an example of hateful lawbreaking. Breaking the law with a willingness to accept the penalty means taking your punishment, that which is prescribed by law, without resistance or complaint. The purpose of the criminal act, after all, is to start a dialogue with those in power, with the aim of persuading them of the injustice of their laws. So it's a performative act. It's a performance. Breaking the law in this loving and open way, this nonviolent way, is a performance, and it has a purpose. It's a symbolic act, and the ultimate purpose of it is to start a dialogue with the ultimate goal of changing the system, changing the laws and the way they're enforced. Paragraph 18. King says, of course, there's nothing new about this kind of civil disobedience. It was seen sublimely in the refusal of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to obey the laws of Nebuchadnezzar because a higher moral law was involved. It was practiced superbly by the early Christians who were willing to face hungry lions and the excruciating pain of chopping blocks before submitting to certain unjust laws of the Roman Empire. To a degree, academic freedom is a reality today because Socrates practiced civil disobedience. Remember the story I told you about Socrates? Here's my comment on that paragraph. Another name for law breaking the law, is civil disobedience. Think about it. One can disobey any type of authority. If one disobeys one's parents, then one is engaged in parental disobedience. If you obey military authorities, then you're engaged in military disobedience. Well, King's concern is disobedience of the laws of the civil authority, hence the term civil disobedience. Civil disobedience is not something new, of course. King mentions several biblical figures who broke the law. They did so, he says, quote, because a higher moral law was involved. Early Christians refused to obey certain unjust laws of the Roman Empire, even though they knew that it would lead to barbaric punishments. King also mentions Socrates, whom I mentioned above. Socrates was tried, convicted, sentenced, and put to death for breaking the laws of Athens. He had a chance to escape from punishment or from confinement, but he refused to do so. He accepted his punishment, though he emphatically disagreed with it. He accepted it. He didn't fight, he didn't whine, protest, struggle, criticize. Though he thought it was wrong, he accepted it. Paragraph 19. We can never forget that everything Hitler did in Germany was legal. In other words, it was the laws that Hitler acted upon had been validly enacted in Nazi Germany. Everything the Hungarian freedom fighters did in Hungary was illegal. It went against the validly enacted laws of Hungary. It was illegal to aid and comfort a Jew in Hitler's Germany. But I'm sure, King says, that if I had lived in Germany during that time, I would have aided and comforted my Jewish brothers, even though it was illegal. In other words, he would have broken the law. If I lived in a communist country today where certain principles dear to the Christian faith are suppressed, I believe I would openly advocate disobeying these anti-religious laws. Okay, here's my gloss on that. King reminds his readers that everything Hitler did in Germany was legal, and everything the Hungarian freedom fighters did in Hungary was illegal. He says that he would have broken laws in both places. He assumes that his readers share these judgments. Maybe you would do the same. Note that King is drawing an analogy between Nazi laws and the Jim Crow laws of the Deep South. Now, have you heard the phrase Jim Crow laws? Here's the first paragraph of the entry on Jim Crow in the Encyclopedia Britannica, which I'm taking to be an authoritative source, written by experts. Jim Crow law in U.S. history means this: any of the laws that enforced racial segregation in the South between the end of Reconstruction in 1877 and the beginning of the Civil Rights Movement in the 1950s. Jim Crow was the name of a minstrel routine, actually it was called Jump Jim Crow, performed beginning in 1828 by its author, Thomas Dartmouth Daddy Rice, and by many imitators, including actor Joseph Jefferson. The term came to be a derogatory epithet for African Americans and a designation for their segregated life. Note that crows, the bird, are black. So Jim Crow, I'm sure, was chosen partly for that reason. The Nazi example shows that not everything that is legal is right or just. The Hungary example shows that not everything that is illegal is wrong or unjust. When justice and legality or legal validity come apart, as they do in the Deep South, King sides with justice. Right? There are times when law and justice converge. And that in that case like that, nobody has a moral dilemma. But when law and justice come apart, an agonizing decision must be made. Do you obey the law even though you sincerely believe it to be unjust or immoral? Or do you violate the law on the ground that it is unjust or immoral? King is saying that you may violate that unjust law, but if you do, it must be violated or broken openly and lovingly, and certainly non-violently. Okay, I can see we have time for about one more paragraph, which means we didn't quite make it to where I had hoped today, but fortunately we still have one more day, and we'll have to go through it fairly quickly, and if we're to get done with the letter, and I hope to. So, final paragraph for today. This is paragraph 20. King writes, I must make two honest confessions to you, my Christian and Jewish brothers. First, I must confess that over the last few years, I have been gravely disappointed with the white moderate. I have almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's great stumbling block in the stride toward freedom is not the white citizens' counselor or the Ku Klux Klanner, but the white moderate, who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice. Notice the typo on the word positive. Who constantly says, I agree with you in the goal you seek, but I can't agree with your methods of direct action. Who paternalistically feels that he can set the timetable for another man's freedom. Who lives by the myth of time, and who constantly advises the Negro to wait until, quote, a more convenient season, unquote. Shallow understanding from people of goodwill is more frustrating than absolute misunderstanding from people of ill will. Lukewarm acceptance is much more bewildering than outright rejection. And let me read my two paragraphs and we'll be done for today. King says here that he must make two honest confessions to his Christian and Jewish brothers. Note the word confession. That's a religious term. And note that King, again, is trying to emphasize what he has in common with his interlocutors or his audience. The first confession is that he is gravely disappointed with the white moderate. King distinguishes between two opponents, both of whom are white. The white moderate and the, quote, white citizens counselor or the Ku Klux Klanner. So there was a group called the White Citizens Council, and you've probably heard of the Ku Klux Klan. The moderate gives King and his followers lukewarm acceptance, while the radical, as I will refer to him or her, gives him outright rejection. The former, according to King, is more bewildering. White moderates, King says, are more devoted to order, i.e., law and order, stability, than to justice. They prefer the absence of tension, or what we might call negative peace, to the presence of justice, or what we might call positive peace. Negative peace is the absence of something, the absence of tension. Positive peace is the presence of something, namely justice. The white moderate claims to share King's end or goal, but rejects his means, the method of direct action. White moderates treat blacks like children rather than like the adults that they are. Treating adults like children is known as paternalism. It comes from the Latin word pater, meaning father. Note King's use of the word paternalistically. So he's explicitly saying that the white moderate looks down on blacks, treats them as though they were children. You can see why King is frustrated by the white moderate. He doesn't know whether the white moderate is with him or against him. Sometimes he feels as though the white moderate is on his side. Sometimes he feels as though the white moderate is not on his side, right? And that's uncertainty. At least he knows that the white radical is against him, right? The Ku Klux Klaner, he knows that that person has no sympathy whatsoever, no agreement either with the means or the ends, right? That's the enemy, you might say. The Klaner is the enemy of blacks. Okay, let's stop there. We're an hour and 21 minutes in. I don't want to go past an hour and 20 minutes, if ever, but today I went a minute over. We have one more day. It'll be probably Monday when I record and post the lecture. I always send you an email, as you know, telling you the lecture is up. I will be in the classroom tomorrow. Nobody has been showing up. Nobody showed up yesterday. Well, one student came in quite late and decided not to stay. So I stayed for a while longer. I always have reading material. If nobody comes, that's fine with me. I will find a way to occupy my time. If you do come, we'll have a discussion of the material that I covered in my lecture. You could ask questions. If you want to stay home and watch the videos, that's fine as well. So it's up to you. So have a great day and a great weekend. Start studying for the exam, which is the 31st of March. Don't put that off to the bitter end, in other words. So again, have a great day and a great weekend. I'll see you on the next video, if not in the classroom.